Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Dr. Drew Ramsey. He's a psychiatrist and one of psychiatry's leading proponents of nutritional psychiatry and the author of Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. He is an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. He founded the Brain Food Clinic in New York City, offering treatment and consultation for depression, anxiety, and emotional wellness concerns. The clinic incorporates evidence-based nutrition and integrative psychiatry treatments with psychotherapy, coaching, and responsible medication management. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Dr. Drew Ramsey to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Dr. Ramsey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's really great to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into your work, man. It's fascinating. It's so fascinating. And one is because you're an actual psychiatrist, you have a clinical background, and you also are somebody who is on the forefront of talking about how nutrition can be used as a way to battle mental health, to improve the way we manage depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of talk right now about the healing benefits of food. And there's people that will say, oh, like just eat this to improve your mood or eat this to reduce your anxiety. So I guess where I want to start is if you had to say, like, out of all the information that's out there, like what are three things that are actually true that's backed by science when it comes to nutrition and how it can be beneficial for the mind? And then what are three things that are just plain old myths?
Truths and myths. I would say one thing for sure that's truth is that food impacts your brain health and mental health. There's just a lot of irrefutable evidence about that I don't think anybody disagrees with. And I think that's very motivating for us. I think that would be like the number one truth. I think the number two truth is while food is brain medicine and food is medicine, that there can be a lot of hyperbole and inadvertently a lot of stigma generation around actual mental health treatments. So oftentimes the people who are, preaching a certain type of diet or a certain singular superfood that's going to cure everything, inherent in that usually is and get you off your medications and is the secret to your recovery and mental health. And I think you and I as mental health veterans know that's BS. But anyway, in terms of asking about truth, so I would say that there's certainly a truth that there's hyperbole, which I think you're alluding to. I think a third truth is that we're learning a lot about mental health. And I hope in all of my work and in my messaging, people really do hear what you mentioned, that I'm a clinical psychiatrist. I saw patients all day right before this interview. Probably approaching 30 hours of Zooming this week. I love clinical work. I love working with people and understanding. I think that sort of humbles you and lets you understand that there aren't a lot of silver bullets other than people dedicating themselves to inner work, and that always pays off. So I guess I could move to like the myths that I see. There's a myth that the important value in talking about food is around meat. I think that's the biggest myth right now in terms of that's the big environmental impact and that's the big nutritional impact. And I think that's really false. Not that I love plants. Plants are awesome. I think it's really interesting. I was a vegetarian for a long time, but to me, in terms of challenges or myths, that's one. Either that plant-based diets are good for your mental health. Most of the data says that's questionable at best. Or, that extreme diets are what you want to employ for mental health. There's certainly a few interesting moves emerging in the data, but I think there's a lot of, myths. Part of that in terms of just quickly where that comes from is that we need to think about the population-based data and apply that to us as individuals and to think about what the differences are between you as an individual and the population-based data often that's being used in kind of your health choices. Let's talk a couple other myths. I say one myth is I would say that celery juice cures anything. I think that's a myth. In fact, if you look at the hard, true evidence of nutritional psychiatry, the only thing that technically celery juice and promoting it might do is increase hospitalizations for mania, according to the most recent evidence. So
now, why is that? Is it just because people are just cutting out all these other nutrients out of their food and they're just...
No, that's because I'm being a little bit of a jerk, Doug, that I think folks who promote things around mental health don't have training and clinical experience and consequences of the recommendations. I don't know, it's kind of one of my pet peeves. So it's because celery juice has a lot of nitrates in it. And if you look at So there's data recently about bipolar disorder and a strong correlation, like 6 times, which is you don't see, like 6x increased risk, increase in terms of hospitalization for mania for people who are daily consumers of nitrated meat products, like beef jerky sticks. So if you eat a Slim Jim beef jerky type stick every day, at least that population, there's a strong correlation. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but what's interesting, if you look at how those types of products work in kind of mouse models, there's a lot of activation of the same pathways that seem to be activated in individuals when they have mania. So, but anyway, that myth, I think, is silver bullet cures. And I'm a guy who promoted kale. I love kale. You know, I founded National Kale Day. I wrote 50 Shades of Kale. Like I appreciate idealization and celebration of foods. That's not what I'm talking about. I think I'm talking about people taking mental health, which is super complex, involves our development, our genetics, our environment, our own personal psychology and temperament, and reduces it down to, you know, just what you eat. And I think at its worst, that's sometimes what nutritional psychiatry gets presented at. So
Right.
Oh boy, I've gotten lost track of it. I don't feel like I gave you 3 truths or 3 myths there very succinctly at all.
Well, I think the truths you talked about are that the way we eat impacts our mental and brain health, right? So you said that there is a lot of research being done right now on food and the impact of mental health.
Let's talk about a third truth, which is that for the first time in our history as human beings caring about mental health and food, there are randomized trials. So up until about 5 years ago, I've been talking about nutritional psychiatry for probably about 15 years, maybe more. But 5 years ago, we got all this data, randomized trials saying, hey, if you take a depressed population and you teach them and encourage them to eat a Mediterranean diet, a significant portion of that population hits full remission. And Doug, I'm really curious what you think when you see studies about that. I really appreciated what you shared as we were opening up, just your own journey to recovery and what you're working on of just like what you think about when you see data like that. Like, one, is kind of recovery possible without proper nutrition? And also whether that data makes sense to you, that people who really kind of gather up their lifestyle, you know, some of that takes discipline and habit, some of it takes education, like whether that's really an important piece of people getting better.
I do. I mean, I know in my own experience in recovery, and one of my core messages has been, you know, you can get sobered, but it doesn't mean you're going to be healthy. It doesn't mean you're going to be happy. It doesn't mean you're going to thrive. And I think the beautiful thing about fitness and health is, yes, you have to do the other work. You have to do the inner work. You have to go back and work on your trauma, and you have to, you know, make amends. You have to stay sober. You have to do all those things. But you also have to be able to learn to deal with the things that you were using the drugs or alcohol to deal with in a healthy way now moving forward, and taking a stand to better yourself. And I think nutrition, exercise can do just that. And because I think in early recovery, especially, I look back to me, the way I felt about myself in that time was crucial. Because if my self-esteem had gone any lower than it already did, or if I was in a bad mood, that's when cravings would come in. That's when I would be like, oh, I might as well just go back to using drugs because
I don't feel better anyway. You know, like life's miserable. Might be drunk and miserable, right?
Yeah. So what have you seen? I mean, you talked about remission. What have you seen in the research as far as people in recovery from addiction? Is there certain foods that people should stay away from? Is there certain foods that have been seen to help? Like, what does that look like?
Well, first, to be clear, as we move from depression and a little bit of data around maybe ADHD, anxiety, and dementia, we move into probably more my clinical experience, and because there isn't a lot of data around nutritional interventions for people with substance use disorders, whether that be alcohol or, and maybe there's a little bit of data, but it's not prominent in the methodology of how to address those disorders. Certainly, there's a lot of literature about individuals with alcohol use disorder, what, you know, traditionally has been called alcoholism. But as you can hear in the language, there's really, I think, an effort of psychiatry to think about these as, you know, these are all substances, and there's a disorder in how people uses them. And it's defined as a disorder because it causes you problems that you define in your life. So really trying to move away from that stigmatizing notion of addiction, right? That's been so prominent, I think, from psychiatry, and made it hard for people to kind of reach out to us and help them take steps towards recovery. So certainly there's a lot of sugar and carbohydrate craving related to alcohol use disorder, in part because as you're drinking a lot, taking in a lot of sugars, there's a lot of just like a smoker has a kind of oral fixation. I'm just in the process of helping one of my patients taper off vaping, and another helping him get off of cigarette smoking after relapsing after a number of years during the pandemic. And part of, besides the craving and anti-craving, maybe medications or replacement therapies briefly, getting people to deal with things like those physical cravings, oral cravings, and the sensations. I think that's where food can play a big role. Like, for example, for me, when I stopped drinking, it's really important for me to stock my fridge with lots of great seltzers and lots of great non-alcoholic kombuchas, just because I like that at the end of the day, and to kind of transition to that, and then a really nice cup or two of herbal tea. But without that kind of replacement, I find myself having a harder time with that kind of what I think is a craving around sugar, sweetness, carbohydrates, and some of that, I would say, like pleasure, as you were talking about, in terms of doing something that betters yourself, right? I think other ways that food gets used is when, what you were talking about, I think is really key about self-esteem and where you are and how you regulate your self-esteem, because there aren't severe immediate physiological consequences of eating crappy food. People feel a little worse, but it's not like, you die, right? I think for me, one of the real implications is psychological. As you said, like I either know, and we think about this in nutritional psychiatry and in my work, my books really is like, I'm doing what I can, because I only so much in my control, to take little steps to really insulate myself and support my mental health and my brain. And it's also, I think, for people who are in recovery, something to do. If you're chopping vegetables for half an hour, it seems really boring, but part of being in early recovery is boredom, right? Of just like, and so cooking for yourself, cooking for others, it's not as thrilling or as exciting, but it's better than sitting around watching TV, and it leads to more nutrition and good habits.
Right. And I think you start to stack these good habits and you start to develop this, what's next mentality, and I can do this mentality, because you're working that muscle of determination, you're working that muscle of perseverance, you're working that muscle of accomplishment, and you begin to realize like, wow, this isn't as hard as I thought it was. And then you want to do more of it. You're like, oh, like it's not that hard to eat a serving of vegetables. Well, let me do more because I'm seeing the benefits from it. So I guess my question is, as far as like from a scientific perspective in the brain, I would say that most people know that if they eat healthier foods, they will feel better about themselves. I think people have that idea, but people have a hard time making that switch in the brain to really actually taking that belief and putting it into action. Have you discovered like why that is?
Well, I think while we can all agree, what we eat dictates some of how we feel, we have a harder time thinking about how dietary choices, and I also put in there alcohol choices, which is a big part of Americans. Most people, or a lot of people listening, maybe your audience has a lot of folks in recovery, but a fair number of calories come from alcohol too, or other beverages, right? The lattes, pumpkin spice latte has a whole lot. There's a whole lot of calories in that spice. So I do think that there are some key reasons that we have disconnects. One is that mental health is kind of, I think, stigmatized, and it's hard for us as we've been pushing and trying to destigmatize mental health conditions as having really biological basis. The idea that like something like food, right, impacts something like alcohol use disorder or depression or ADHD. I think it's been a little hard leap, and there hasn't been a lot of professional support. It's not like when you go talk to a mental health professional really ever before in history, they say, hey, let me take a clear accounting of what you eat, and let's think about some of these foods together. Let's think about some of your goals and how some of between sessions, when you're out there, you're in the grocery store, you're feeding yourself, let's think about two things. One, let's think about how you nourish yourself and what that teaches us about you. Right? Do you avoid the grocery store? Do you plan things out? Do you lovingly cook for yourself? What do you do? And then two, let's make sure you're getting all the nutrients that, the data is really clear. Most Americans aren't getting zinc. About half of Americans don't get the daily recommended allowance of zinc. That's a nutrient that literally signals the genes that tells your brain to recover and grow. And that's not like weird science. That's just like how zinc influences the promotion of a molecule called BDNF, which is kind of a miracle grow for the brain type molecule. So that's what nutritional psychiatry is really trying to do, is encouraging self-care and self-nourishment in really kind of specific ways around food categories. So, you're asking like what works in recovery, like definitely focusing on carbs and having healthy carbs. So you're craving pasta, right? Pasta and red sauce. Okay, it's a lot of sugar, If you can switch over to maybe like a gnocchi with pesto, right? Maybe have a little wild salmon with that. So you're adding in some protein. So you're going to block wanting to just, as I do, keep eating that gnocchi until there's no gnocchi anywhere near me. So, right. So to sort of understand where you get into trouble, I get into trouble when I'm at my mom and dad's house and they have all these little jars of like every cracker and cookie I could ever possibly want. It's loving. It's a loving act. But man, I'll find myself there with like 3 jars open, just hoovering down the Triscuits and the whatever. And it just, I don't know. So I think catching those habits and catching ourselves in those moments is really also a key part of it.
Right. And you brought up a good point that like in traditional medicine, it's not like you're going to the doctor and you're saying you have depression or anxiety or even that you're even overweight or have high blood pressure. And they're saying, hey, like, what do you get at the grocery store? Do you shop on your own? How many nights do you eat with your family? Like how many days a week are you going to the gym? It's more or less, here's a prescription pad, like here's a prescription. And I'm not an anti-medication guy, but this is just what I've experienced in my own life. And you're somebody who's in both lanes, right? You're in the traditional medicine route where you have the clinical background, but you're also in this rising, now I don't want to say holistic because you do obviously have the medical background, but this wave of now we have to be more proactive in the way that we treat our health. So what do you think is like the path forward for doctors, for people to help us combat this massive epidemic that we're facing?
I think those are great points, Doug. I think one, people's medical experience in the medical system until you're really sick is often very bad. We love the doctors who save our lives, but you go to your primary care doctor and there's not a lot of time and we don't have anything set up. Like if you're a primary care doctor, I don't have a nutritionist or dietitian usually to refer to. Insurance is not going to cover that unless you're really sick. I mean, it's really... So there are some changes. I don't want to be pessimistic, but it's the way we think about primary prevention doesn't include a lot of food messaging. And it's food messaging that doesn't work. I mean, part of what inspired me to get into this field and kind of help develop nutritional psychiatry, one, there was no talk of food in mental health and in psychiatry training. But two, I felt like the messaging that I was giving my patients, hey, don't eat any fat, guys. Don't eat any salt. Don't eat any cholesterol. Those are all like interesting points to talk and debate, but those are really ineffective messages for behavioral change. All that causes people to do, for the most part, is eat carbohydrates. And that really isn't what we want to do. What we want to help people do is focus on feeding their neurons, feeding their health with more whole foods. All of these studies focus on the Mediterranean diet, but really what the data says is we want to move people off of highly processed foods. The best study in this, where 1/3 of patients with depression went into full remission, were able to reduce about 21 processed food meals per week and replace that with like an extra serving of fish a week, an extra serving of fruit and vegetables every day. As you said, like an extra serving of, just drop some greens in and begin to take those little steps. So it is an exciting time. And
Well, no, I think you brought up an interesting point. I think that we got to focus on what's worked. And if you're saying that there's some data that suggests that eating a more heavily Mediterranean focused diet for people with depression can be the path forward to not only help with their mental health, but I would imagine it's going to help with their physical health too.
For sure. And let's be real specific for everybody listening. Like, what do I mean by that? Because it sounds, I'm from rural Indiana before I moved to New York. Mediterranean diet was like Italian food. It's like Pizza Hut, right? That's, so Mediterranean diet to me, the number one first thing I think about is what oil are you gobbling down, cooking your vegetables in, using the majority of your calories, because coming from which fat? And for me, I know 100% it's olive oil because I'm going through multiple big jars per month for my family of 4. I'm looking to get a significant portion of my calories from olive oil. And I'm sauteing all my vegetables in it. One of the reasons a lot of people find plant-forward diets not so satiating is they're also low fat. And I really think fat is a great thing to be eating a fair amount of and trying to get a lot of calories from monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. So that's going to be your olive oils, your seafood, and your probably wild meats I would put in there, and nuts as well. And that's the way we kind of begin to Mediterraneanize the diet. Other things that just, I would say are superstars, I focus on them on Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. My new book has my list of power players. I had a lot of fun promoting kale, but it's fine with me if you don't ever eat kale. What's interesting and important, I think, is that category of leafy greens. And so the power players kind of draw from the different food categories that I really try to emphasize as a nutritional psychiatrist. So things like small fish in the bivalves, clams, mussels, oysters, anchovies, sardines, wild salmon, herring. Most people don't have these in their diet. And kind of why not? Usually it's lack of experience, lack of education, lack of knowledge, and then also how to how to begin to experiment a little bit. I didn't eat any seafood or fish until I was 30, so I know a lot about this process. So that was disgusting. And now, I shuck oysters, and not because I'm like, oh, this brain food, I gotta like grin and bear it here, but because I enjoy that food, what it means to me, how it tastes. So I think there's a lot of, encouragement. I want people to feel that as you hear Mediterranean diet, that sounds weird. Like, this means olive oil, it means more roasted vegetables, more nuts and seeds, and more seafood. And I have this little rhyme: seafood, greens, nuts and beans, and a little dark chocolate. It's just the kind of way that as you're thinking about your week right now, like, how many of those foods and food categories did you nail? And if not, you got an awesome quick step for maybe a little goal. And I so often meet people who are like, oh, I really like sardines. I haven't had those in a while. Or, oh, I don't have a recipe for those. And I say, hey, check out, I've got a great all-kale Caesar salad in the most recent book. Like, there's an amazing dashi if you like things like ramen. There are all kinds of ways to approach these food categories that can be challenging for a lot of us.
Well, that makes sense. And I've heard you talk about the importance of kind of moving towards a more Mediterranean focused diet if you're trying to, improve your mental health, if you're trying to, it's overall health. Like, the Mediterranean diet has always been talked about as being like one of the best approaches. So let's just say somebody's listening to this right now and they've struggled with anxiety off and on throughout their life, and they just can't seem to get a grip on it. From a nutritional perspective, if you could maybe give this listener or somebody some tips on, okay, these are a couple foods that are scientifically backed to help you with your anxiety, and these are just a couple that are going to really make you feel more anxious, what would they be?
So the first step when I encounter anxiety is trying to help people think through and understand a little bit of an inventory of what part of their anxiety is a superpower, because anxiety is a superpower. I mean, anxiety has kept us alive. It's a big part of our intuition. One of the first things when people are like, oh, I've got a feeling, an intuition, usually it was a worry. And it's like, I'm going to take a left turn here, not a right turn. So differentiating what's sort of your superpower and what I would call the doctor pathological. Anxiety, where like when you're done with it, you're like, that was not superpower. That would be like grinding on whether, I did this or that or said this or that at a party. So just to start with that. And then in terms of anxiety, the data is limited. Certainly for people who have gluten sensitivity or gluten issues or food sensitivity issues, cutting out those foods has significant impact. So a good example is people with gluten sensitivities. It was documented. You eat things that have wheat or gluten containing products in them, and you get a lot of gas, distension, diarrhea. It's very unpleasant. For some patients, it's really worse. Eventually, over time, it erodes the line of your intestine. You don't absorb enough B12. It can really be severe. And most people, there are millions of people in America who have not just gluten sensitivity, but full celiac disease that don't know it. But anyway, about 75% of those individuals have severe anxiety. And if you take them off of gluten, put them on gluten, take them off the food that is triggering their food sensitivity, they go down to normal levels of anxiety, about 20%. So sort of one way to think about it. In terms of foods that I think of in relationship to anxiety, it's really troubling because there's not a lot of data. There's one correlational study about choline, which you find in tofu and eggs, but it's not the type of data that would want us really pushing or recommending those foods. However, when I think about, all right, what does an egg provide for someone who's anxious? It provides lots of B vitamins. It provides a nice kind of shot of protein and fat. It's a very low calorie food. So you get this mix of satiation, but not getting a lot of calories, and it's very nutrient dense. One of the reasons eggs are on the cover of Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. But again, this isn't the most solid, significant data. But when I think about people with anxiety, first I begin to think about B vitamins and protein and where I see those in their diet. Because those are the nutrients that are most linked to anxiety, and kind of where nutritional psychiatry comes from is we looked at what nutrients are most important for mental health. Things, everybody knows B12 is super important for mental health. But if you ask anybody, doctors, patients, like, hey, what's the top nutritional source of B12 out there in the world? Like, nobody knows. Or like, hey, folate. We all agree folate's super important for mental health, right? It's in prenatal vitamins. Like, what are the top 5 sources of folate? We should all know, right? You have the most amazing miracle between your ears, the human brain. It runs on, 30 odd nutrients. You'd think we'd be like the first thing they teach us in school, right? Like, these are the 5 foods you got to eat to get folate. So, by the way, the top source of B12, I don't mean to be a jerk and tease people who don't, I didn't know this stuff either, but the top source of B12 is clams, which is really interesting, and bivalves. Clams, mussels, and oysters are super concentrated in that. And folate, which is vitamin B9, you find really high concentration in lentils. One of the reasons we have a lot of lentils in our house. but also in asparagus. And there's a lot of B12 in a lot of other places too, but just to mention that. But foods for anxiety, I would say, is looking at fats and proteins, focusing on where you find those B vitamins. So thinking about the foods I just mentioned. I'm also thinking about foods that trigger anxiety, right? Yes, what we would avoid. And that's, people taking a careful inventory about caffeine in their life, what it means to them, where they use it, how dependent they are. I meet so many people who have either sleep apnea or just bad modern sleep hygiene, right? I don't try to go to bed until 11. Like when people are like, oh, I sleep 8 hours. I'm just like, anybody right now listening to this who are like, yeah, I get about 8 hours of sleep. I just want to call Bouchard. And I challenge you to prove it to me and to Doug.
Why are you picking on me? I drink too much caffeine and I go to bed at 11.
Well, because I care about you.
I'm joking.
But no. But I feel, because I do that too sometimes. I'm sitting here with my Earl Grey cup of tea, which is maybe a better choice than coffee for this time of day for me. But because I've been tracking my sleep for a year, and it's where it's so actually hard to get 4 good sleep cycles for, if you have any, I would call it complications. Like if you have pets, if you have kids, if you have a partner, if you, if you have a job that you worry, it's just getting solid sleep is a real challenge in my experience from trying to do it. So, but anyway, just quickly, food drinks, looking for those sources of caffeine, which can be, some people get surprised. Like the other day I had a Cliff Bar and it had like, 50, 75 milligrams of caffeine in it.
Really?
Yeah. And my kid had picked it out. He's like, oh, this one looks like a good flavor. I'm like, all right. It's like better than a candy bar I thought. And then you look at it, it's like, so there's a lot of different stimulants and caffeines. There, green tea powder, guarana powder. So I ask people to just kind of look at that. If you're taking a bunch of supplements or you have a protein powder in the morning and you haven't flipped it over and read through it, especially if it's advertised for metabolism, you're taking a bunch of phytochemical stimulants, most likely. So I'll look for those. And then I would say the other is, a lot of times I see a lot of people searching for all the food causes, and they need a good course of CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a therapy that is evidence-based to deal with anxiety. It's a short-term therapy that teaches you tools, which people like. My therapies tend to be long-term, and people are like, am I going to see you, how long am I going to see you kind of worries. And lots, so CBT is just cognitive behavioral therapy, something I think people should know about, as well as, improving diet. And then all of my patients with anxiety are just like, they always say the thing that helps the most is exercise. And in my experience, having anxiety, I think that's really both, I would say exposure and exercise are the two that for me, having had a lot of anxiety throughout my life, ranging from, like stage fright to some panicky stuff. Like I just find incredible confidence in exposure. And the more that you do that, and the more you confront anxiety head on, find the faster it goes away. The more that you do and challenge yourself with the things you're worried about, the faster that resolves. So
let's dive into that, because I think that's an approach that, maybe people might not be as familiar with is exposure. And I've, in my own experience with anxiety and panic, I've found that when I've tried to fight my anxiety and fight the panic, it makes it worse when I'm trying to just push it away instead of just letting it go. And I read this book that changed my life. It was called like Dare, I think. I forget who wrote it, but it essentially taught you how to just almost invite more anxiety into your life when you're having the anxiety, because it helps you to just accept it as part of where you're at, and you don't try to create a bigger stress response. So when you talk about exposure, like what do you really mean by that? And if somebody's listening to this and they're feeling anxious or they're having some sort of panic, how can they use that to help mitigate their feelings?
For sure. And so I think there are 2 ways to think about this. I think there's actual ways, like clinical exposures for people who really have crippling anxiety. And so I don't want to have anybody who has those conditions, or something like obsessive compulsive disorder, where there's really, having a skilled exposure therapy clinician is important. I'm really indebted. I feel like my education in anxiety comes from Blair Simpson and the anxiety disorders group at Columbia, which is just a leader in this field. And I always remember a grand rounds that she gave around treating people with really severe anxiety and the importance of exposure. Exposure actually beating some of the medicines, but it had to be daily exposure. The error that so many people made is like, going once a week and like hold the snake or, confront the germs. And that doesn't work. You got to do it every day for a couple hours. So that's clinical exposure. I think what you're asking, what do I mean about is I mean about the process by which when we sit and understand our fears and the ones that we can confront, we confront them in an active way. I think it's very empowering for all of us as individuals, developmentally, and I would say also spiritually. So when I think about exposure, I think, for example, I'm really, my friends, I don't surf very much, but I get very anxious about sharks, like really anxious about sharks. And so for me, kind of being out there, or I get really anxious about the water in the dark. And so last time I was near a surf break, before sunrise, I don't know, I found myself pushing out into the water, and feeling the fear come, and I wouldn't say welcoming it, as you say, daring, but in some ways really wanting to breathe through it and really let myself know that this is going to be okay. And so I think that would be an example of an exposure. I would say others can be, a lot of people I think have fears around confrontation or fears around clearly communicating. So I think kind of really dedicating oneself to that. So basically, things that make you anxious, one, sometimes, again, that's a superpower. It's a good signal. Avoid that stuff. Don't be anxious about stuff you don't like. But oftentimes, things that make us anxious is, it's a real signal of an opportunity. Because oftentimes, anxiety and excitation, Doug, are very cross-wired in people.
Yeah, and I think I believe when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to fear, my own personal experience is what I'm speaking from, is that sometimes the fear of the outcome, the fear that we create in our head of what's going to happen when we do that thing is way bigger than the fear itself. And the example I like to use, because this is something that I have struggled with, is for the longest time I was so nervous to ask a girl out, like in a grocery store, because I was just so either insecure. I was like, all right, if she says no, then every other girl is going to say no. And what did I do? I created this bigger outcome where I said, okay, if she says no, that means every other girl is going to say no, instead of what it really was, okay, if she says no, like she says no, and it's just her, like move on, there'll be somebody else. And I think a lot of people do that when it comes to certain things that they're trying to tackle too. It could be applying for a job. It could be creating a podcast. It could be standing up for themselves in a situation where they don't feel comfortable, whatever it is, where they are attaching this expectation of what's going to happen and making it so that it's going to be like that forever instead of it just in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, you touched on a few of my favorite points I like to make with patients. One is what we call catastrophization, right? That we future paint and it's going to be like horrible. And I think the problem with that, number one, is it disempowers us because it sort of says, oh, we're going to freeze in time and then all this bad stuff's going to happen and we're not going to react. And that's not true of us, right? That we always are adjusting and paying attention and thinking and worrying. So that's one reason catastrophization is so, I don't know, horrible. It kind of makes it sound like what? So like when this bad thing start happening, you're not going to like change your stance or do something different or, so that's one thing that certainly I think is important in all of us to spot. And really, I would say, I talk about the deconstruction of it, of what's the meaning of that and why we're doing that to ourselves. You touched on it, is really encouraging myself and people I work with to focus on process versus outcome. Not that I don't care about outcomes. I've published books. I really care about those and getting those finished. It wasn't just the process. But when I think about what's really valuable to me in all of that, it's been the process of it. It's been the working with the illustrator on the last book and the editors. It's been growing a community online and interacting with lots of people in I guess somewhat random way, but over time really meaningful way. So it's that process of being creative and translating the science or being creative and working with patients that matters to me. And I think I've learned that really early in my career, just in terms of outcome, like talking about recovery. If I'm working with an individual and they relapse, if I'm just outcome focused, like I'm a bad doctor and they're a bad patient. Whereas if I'm process focused, that happens all the time. What can we learn from that? What should we do differently? Is there anything we could have done differently? Maybe that was just going to happen. I had a patient relapse and it was like, look, there's nothing anyone could have done. I was determined to do that. So, and I think it's what we value in our life. We value we value that feeling of sitting around jamming together with our friends versus, I don't know, like putting the album out there, right? Most of us sit around and jam with friends. That's where the pleasure and the healing is.
You brought up relapse, and I think this could be a good time for you to talk about this and any insight you have on, there's a lot of people, when this comes out, it'll be 2022. There's a lot of people that are going to start a new eating plan. and they're going to go all in on, cutting out all the processed foods, switching to a Mediterranean diet and what have you. And then there's going to be times where they slip up and they either maybe cheat or they eat something they didn't want to. And then from there, instead of continuing and accepting that as part of the process, they attach themselves to the outcome and they're like, oh, I'm just done. I'm going to go back to eating the way I was eating last year. So what advice do you have? What do you tell your patients when they're on that path, when they're on the journey to making a health transformation and they end up having a setback or a slip up?
I think I listen about how it happened, because oftentimes people are really, really good when they slow down and stop beating themselves up about it, just kind of like understand how it happened, right? At what point did you understand it was going to happen? What did you do about it? I think oftentimes people use slip-ups and really, we talk a lot about this in our clinic. One of our clinicians, Samantha Elkreef, is just really great about this and making sure people don't do this. We're just like, okay, so, whatever, you broke a rule. We're looking at 21 meals a week, say 28 eating things if you snack once a day. 20, all right. Maybe that's also telling you need to build some of that in. And your plan's too stringent. If I don't have a little ice cream or brownie every now and then, I don't know. I just like that stuff. I don't care that it's not that good for me. I do some things every now and then that aren't the best, most optimal for my health. So, and I don't want to always feel horrible and beat myself up about that. Also, I have kids. Well, I'm going to raise my kids with that ice cream or cake. The hell I am. I want my kids to, if they want to, certainly I'm going to try and educate them about sugar, but I'm not going to. I think there are ways to be healthy and still be able to live within, the modern foodscape. So your question, which is really good. So anybody, hi there, if you're in early either recovery or early food changes, I think making the runway longer. And I think so often when people don't drink, they don't drink for 30 days. My experience with that is, that's a great accomplishment. If that's what you're doing, I think that's awesome. But I don't think any of the cognitive or emotional effects of stopping alcohol consumption really begin to emerge in the first 30 days. I think the same thing for food changes. What we see with antidepressants and with psychotherapy, and I would say also with nutritional psychiatry, is you're talking about a number of weeks, but optimally a number of months. Because if you think that underneath this, and I talk a lot about this in Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, underneath this, what we're doing biologically is we're shifting the brain towards more brain growth and away from a pro-inflammatory state. Not that everybody's brain is in some pro-inflammatory state. We just are living a lifestyle that's very pro-inflammatory. We have a new e-course, Healing the Modern Brain, that really focuses on, all of the various aspects of our lifestyle that can really increase our inflammation and what are some actionable ways that, every day we can take steps to, again, promote brain growth and decrease inflammation.
Right. Yeah, I think playing the long game and lengthening the runway is so important for people. And I think also just focusing on where you're at, because I say this a lot, and this isn't my original quote, but it's said pretty often, is that, you can't compare your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. You have to really stay in the here and now and stop future tripping and stop catastrophizing and stop saying, okay, how am I going to eat healthy for the next 5 years when I haven't eaten healthy for the last, 5 months or 5 weeks or 10 years or whatever the number is. And it's just focus on eating healthy for your next meal.
It's this dual nature that I think a lot of us, who have changed some habits, understand, which is there's both the long runway. This isn't 30 or 90 days. It's about living a more sober lifestyle. And at the same time, you only have to do one thing today. It's not that hard today. I've got 8.5 hours till bedtime. I can do almost anything for 8.5 hours, right? And I've always loved that focus that kind of comes out of, being really mindful and present, right? Checking in with if cravings come up, what they mean, and at the same time, giving ourselves permission that today isn't forever. Today's just one moment in our life. I also want to provide more encouragement. If you've made changes, I think that's awesome. I think if you're a few weeks in, you've learned things from those changes. You're learning what you're really craving and you're really missing. I think you're also learning where people have been helpful or not helpful. When I've stopped drinking, I have some folks who give I always liked IPAs, and they get a lot of those near beer IPAs. I just I have no interest in that. And I know it's a really nice thing, but for me, that just can't, it's just, I don't know, that's just not in any way part of my plan. Whereas for somebody else, man, that near beer plan or beer replacement, that's really great for them. So really, I think honor what you are learning about yourself. And then I think just hang in there. You're a few weeks into something, right? And really, I think it's a time, gosh, I wish I could just show up in everybody's like car or wherever they're listening and give them a little like spirit rallying talk of just like, this is really the time to double down, right? Because you're beginning to think, oh, you're close to your finish line. You've done a few weeks, right? But no, this is time to really double down. Like I'd commit to even longer.
What does the research say about alcohol and anxiety? Because and depression, I guess too. Because obviously, if you have a drinking problem and you drink too much, it can start to impact your life in a negative way. But there's plenty of people right now that are drinking casually and struggling with anxiety, and they're trying to figure out where that all comes from. So can just drinking regularly like impact people's anxiety and other areas of mental health?
I think so. I mean, for sure, the research says that. I mean, alcohol is a central nervous depressant, and what we experience is kind of calming us down, or, and that disinhibition, that little, euphoria we get. That's definitely a physiological effect of alcohol, but it's part of the effect of our nervous system kind of having the volume turned down. Usually on the prefrontal, the part of your brain. It's funny. One of the directors of the emergency room at Columbia psychiatrists talk about the super ego, so the part of our brain or part of our mind that follows rules and gives us guilt and morals. Like he's always say that dissolves in alcohol, i.e., when we drink more alcohol, just like we get more disinhibited, and that's some of that's fun. People go dance a little bit more and maybe chat a little bit more, but I think alcohol is really awful for anxiety and depression. I think if you have either one of those two conditions, I think it's hard to get this out of people, right? In the sense of just to be really clear, like, let's just be really clear. Alcohol is really bad for anxiety and depression. And, a lot of people do fine with a little bit of drinking, but what I think is happening today, particularly around alcohol in America, is just a lot of excessive drinking, particularly around COVID and anxiety. Alcohol is a very powerful anti-anxiety agent. I mean, if you look at what, if I give somebody Xanax or Ativan, it's basically a pill form of alcohol, but both bind to the GABA receptor. And there's that, kind of letdown, that feeling people have after, half a glass of wine is very physiological, right? It's a GABA. GABA is the major disinhibitory, so kind of turning down the volume overall in our brain. It's a workhorse neurotransmitter. So I guess if you're struggling with anxiety and depression and you're on the fence, did you stop drinking for a while or not? I just probably put a big vote on just don't drink for a while. See how it feels. See where you get challenged. And then I just think if you're acutely depressed or anxious, if you're really struggling, it's hard because people use it as a medicine, and it works, right? It calms you down. Maybe it helps you sleep, but it really doesn't work. And so the lots of great things, probably more around alcohol, more familiar with right now, around medicines that help people. I think naltrexone is really interesting medicine that's really helpful for people in terms of both carbohydrate craving, but also alcohol craving and opioid craving. So, but yeah, those are, I hope people feel my encouragement. And I don't know, I just think that there's a lot of movement right now, right? There's a lot more sobriety. There's a lot more, mocktail mixers and the idea that we want to, I feel this, like I want to dance and I want to have fun. I want to socialize and be creative and talk with people and be rowdy, but I don't want to drink. And I don't think I need to drink for any of that. And I think that's maybe hard, or that's a hard kind of juncture right now where society is pivoting a little bit. At least in New York, I was seeing a lot more of that.
It's funny. People will do these sobriety challenges or dry January or sober October. And I'll ask them so how did you feel? And they're like, oh, I felt amazing. And I'm like, so you going to drink? And they're like, yeah, I'm going to go back. I'm like, you just told me how amazing you felt. It's so socially acceptable and everybody kind of does it around their birthday. Everybody does it at tailgates.
Yeah, look, I mean, you and I are men also. I think it's hard. I mean, it's hard for everybody. I think for men, I haven't been drinking for a little bit, not as long as you, but what do I ask you to go do? You want to go shoot some hoops, bro? You want to get a cup of tea? It feels, that traditional, what are the guys going to go out and do? They're not going to go out and do yoga. They're going to go get hammered. And it's, I mean, I think it's really, I don't know, a lot of my patients who don't drink, they've been going to holiday parties and a few of them are like, yeah, I just get a beer, but I go to the bathroom and I pour it out and I put water in the thing. And I sit and sip on it with everybody, I toast everybody, blah. And, it's I wonder what your tips are for men who are listening and women, but who are thinking about maybe, to, drink less or not drink. Like, were there things that really helped you?
Yeah, I mean, my story is kind of unique in that I got into recovery when I was incarcerated. So I had that above my head when I got out, that I was fearful of going back. But I think the thing that really helped me initially was fitness, was changing the way that I attached behavior to an emotion. I talk about this often because I have no therapy background. This is just me and my own logical mind, like thinking about how I did this. And that's that whenever I was anxious or stressed or depressed, I would take a drug back in the day. For me, it was painkillers and Coke and pot. And so once I learned that I could be stressed, anxious, and depressed, which by the way were normal emotions considering what I was going through, I learned that when I would go for a run, or if I did some push-ups, or if I, called somebody that I felt, connected to in a way, or if I bettered myself, I felt better. Maybe not in the same intensity, with the same intensity that the drugs made me feel, but I felt better enough that I was like, oh, I don't want to use right now. And then I just started to stack those days, and then I started to get inspired to change other habits, and then I could go on and on with my own story. But in the make a long answer short, fitness, changing my habits, eating better, and focusing on how far I had come and how far I had to go was the catalyst for my change early on.
Doug, thanks for sharing all that. I really appreciate you being upfront in public. And I think certainly your story is unique, but so many men and women have struggled with incarceration and the consequences with that. And I'm just so grateful that you've, launched out of that and really, just for your own personal fitness, but also inspiring other people that, great change is possible. And I like how you're talking about stacking these habits. That's really how I think about it with patients of, I'm trying to get them connected with community. I'm trying to get them moving their bodies. We've increasingly been talking about mental fitness where, I love being a therapist. I want to talk about your mom, your development, your trauma. I'm really interested in all that stuff. But there's also this part of me that, I say as a cheerleader, but like, no matter how much I hope you understand about that, I also want to, do my best as an agent of behavioral change to have you, connecting and loving really deeply and taking care of yourself so you have a really long and robust life. And so, it's wonderful to hear a little of your story of how you've done that.
And it wasn't easy, right? But I think I made the example earlier. I made the statement that once you try just a little change, you try a little something, you realize like, oh, like this isn't as hard as I thought it was. And then you realize how much better it makes you feel in that moment. And you say to yourself, I want more of this. Like I want to keep feeling the way that this made me feel. And then that starts to add up and it becomes this snowball effect. And over time you look back and it's been 3 months. You're like, wow, like it started with me just going for a walk and now I just ran a 5K, or it started with me just doing a push-up and now I've done 50, or it started with me asking one person out. Now I have 3 dates a week, or whatever the example is. But I know in order to make a change, any kind of change, and make it long lasting, you have to sleep well. So I think this is a good way to kind of segue into sleep, because we've talked about caffeine and I've told you that I probably drink, 5 cups of coffee a day. I'm the worst, but
I don't know whether the worst, Doug. I mean, I think if you sleep well, I think, if I would say for, like 7, putting on solid 7, I think and I think it's also like, I don't know, I bet you're doing a lot. It seems like you're doing a lot, building a platform, have a platform, got a podcast, working on a lot. So I wonder, what pops into my head is how do we take a habit like that and a statement like that? I mean, Doug's joking a little bit, but and kind of have it be something that he feels really good about. Like I used to be like Doug. I drank a ton of coffee with milk in it. I had all these digestive problems. I'm not saying Doug does, but and you know what I did? I swapped it out for Earl Grey tea. I got kind of like hooked on Earl Grey tea. And now I don't know. And in that period of not having coffee, I didn't have any headaches or anything, but it just kind of showed me that like almost like you were saying earlier about how when we future paint and catastrophize, that like we're so dependent on caffeine and we're so dependent on the coffee. And it was funny for me personally to shake that up a little bit. And then now have this, like, I would say variety of mildly caffeinated beverages where I'll do a couple coffees in the morning and then, a bunch of different teas and herbal teas. And
well, I guess I appreciate your kindness with me, but and I was clearly making fun of myself. But so for the average person though, that wants to improve their sleep, and they want to know the relationship of what they eat and nutrition plays into that. You hear people say, don't eat a couple hours before you go to bed. You hear people say no caffeine after a certain time. You hear people say, don't eat this or don't eat that. Like,
those first two are great. By the way, the first two are really accurate. You shouldn't eat late at night. There's a really strong relationship between dementia risk and late night eating. And it's also a time where people are struggling with like food quantity control. Like I'm a little bit of a stress eater. And so like if you get me going with the carbs and I'm worried, I'll really stay up late eating. Whereas like if I'm asleep at 9:30, I'm not going to be in the pantry and dad's cookie jar at 11:30 like, whoa, did I just eat 12 cookies? Like, uh-oh. So let's start at the beginning of the day. The first most important thing to do, no matter how tired you are tomorrow morning, is to get out of bed and go watch the sun come up. As you begin to do that, low lateral light it's a special type of light. There's a really fun brain geek, super genius guy, Andrew Huberman at Stanford, who he's an ophthalmology professor. And
yeah, he's been on the show.
Yeah, Andrew's great, right? And I've always given patients this advice, something we know in psychiatry, but he really explains it in around the wavelengths that are going on in those early hours. And what we've understood now, and researchers have understood, is that really begins to set the clocks, right? So you get that early morning light, basically tamps down all the melatonin production, what little is going still on there. You set your clocks, literally there are clock genes that you have. And then it's thinking about that day, if we're going to go to bed, which I'm going to encourage people to be in bed by 9 p.m., probably at the latest. There are a couple of key activities during this day. One you mentioned is nutrition, right? We not only don't want to eat late, we want to avoid stimulants. Those could be things even like dark chocolate, one of my favorites, or coffee. Or, if somebody's drinking, I've had this patient, people having a big, their protein shake before they work out at 4 and they still can't sleep. And we're looking, and then, again, you look at that ingredient list and it's filled with, green tea extract and other, stimulant analogs to promote weight loss. So making sure good sources of protein during the day, particularly, and good sources of fat. Again, just these being essential pieces, right? Where does melatonin come from? Melatonin gets made from serotonin in the pineal gland. Where does serotonin come from? Serotonin gets made from tryptophan and iron. Those are the two main things that and I think a little vitamin B9 in there. But, so making sure we have these essential elements for our brain to function. And those, not too many specific foods. You will see people recommend foods with melatonin. There's no reason to do that. Things like dark cherry juice, they have, very, very small amounts. When we give people melatonin to help them sleep, the recommendations is really 1 to 3 milligrams. I find a lot of people taking way too much melatonin, but the amount in these foods are picograms. I do think it's super cool to know what we call homology, that in the natural world, we see melatonin in other species and organisms. I just think that's super cool. But those foods aren't going to help you sleep. And then in terms of then exercise, even if that's stretching, and in my world, I consider exercise movement. I go for a brisk walk for 20, 30 minutes, that counts. Then the next piece is shutting down the day, which is when the sun goes down, your lights go off and you have really minimal lighting in the house. Even small amounts of light really prevent melatonin from being expressed and produced and released. So we really want dimmer lights and a kind of winding down period. And that's contrary to most, a lot of people want, a big dinner, watch TV but sort of, I don't mean to judge it, but sort of have a habit of that. And, what you're doing there is getting a lot of visual stimulation late at night, right before sleep. So I try to ask people to cluster their watching habits. So if you're going to have a big, you love watching live shows, like maybe that's your Friday night. But during the week, when you're really more dependent on your creativity and wakefulness, it's not nights to watch. That's nights to have a nice meal, maybe do some stretching, have a cup of tea, and read something, go to bed early. So there is no mental health without sleep, right? It's really the other piece of sleep that our new course, Healing the Modern Brain, we focus a little bit on this, and I'll let you guys all hear about it because I just think it's cool. There's this new part of the brain that got discovered, which is the way that the brain deals with waste. And so the brain excretes or kind of gets rid of about 7 grams of waste every single night. And it does this particularly during stage 3 sleep. And it's one of the reasons I started tracking my sleep, was really to try and, be clear. I want to get all the waste out. And it's one of the things that motivates me to sleep is the idea my brain takes pretty good care of me. I mean, I have a wonky brain. I've struggled with all kinds of strange things over my life. But overall, my brain's taking really good care of me. Just like, Doug, your brain's taking really good care of you, So, and I think most people listening, if we think about it, all the things you did today, you didn't even think about, from waking up to breathing to, So, it feels like us returning that favor and taking good care of our brain and letting it clear out all its waste is really, I find that very motivating. All I have to do is go to bed. That's the other thing. Think about I try to every night, Doug, take out the trash like I'm supposed to. And I'm like 80%, right? But it's crazy. Go to bed, your brain takes out the trash. You don't have to do anything. Just close your eyes. So I find that very motivating. And just again, one of the reasons we encourage people to get the 8 hours of sleep is 4 sleep cycles. So you're getting 4 cleaning cycles of the brain, because when you go to sleep, your brain cycles down very deep. So you go down into light and then deep sleep. And then as you kind of come back out towards wakefulness, this is when you have REM sleep, when you're dreaming, your eyes are twitching, right? And then you go back down again and you go down into that deeper sleep where you're doing the big brain cleaning. So
sleep is key. And and I think you made a really good point in that it starts at the beginning of the day. You talked about going out and referencing Dr. Andrew Huberman and getting some sunlight as the sun comes up, and then kind of how you navigate your day through that. I guess the last thing I want to ask you is, you kind of touched on this a little bit. You said that it's not like you're going to eat a certain food and then you're going to feel really bad, right? But I would imagine there are probably certain foods that after you eat them, you probably won't have much energy, which I'm sure would affect your mood indirectly or directly. So would you say there's a few foods, if somebody's listening, that they're like, man, well, what food should I stay away from if I want to feel my best?
Number one for me would be liquid calories, including liquid calories and alcohol. But I just think that people, and I'm guilty of this myself, you'll down 1,000 calories in a Frappuccino smoothie thing, and that's half your caloric load for the day. So, and you do it fast, right? And that's just going to shut your whole system down. So I would avoid those liquid calories and things like that. It's where I almost always try and get my patients, off of all sodas, switching over to, they're all so many interesting beverages now, from seltzers with a little tiny drop of juice to flavored seltzers to, hop water. I mean, it's incredible. So getting off the liquid calories, I think that's number one. 2, I think big processed meals. It doesn't matter to me if it's your, fried chicken meal from KFC, or if it's a burger meal with fries, or, those, especially in the middle of the day, are just going to knock people down. There's already a melatonin secondary peak at about 3 p.m. Part of that siesta phenomenon, eat, rest. It does follow some natural biology. And so if you're not in a position where you're going to take a little cat nap, you want to really be focused at lunch on protein and crunchy plants. As you go into the carbs, or as you go into big, meaty, heavy meal, it's going to put you down. I would say those are, in terms of people feeling acutely bad, I think part of the challenge is a lot of foods that make us feel bad. There's not an instant, right? You can eat a whole bag of chips. You're not going to feel awful, right? I mean, little potato chips, right? It's a ton of calories, but your body handles, body thinks it's run into some, delicious source of food that it should store up for the winter. It's stoked you found a bag of chips. But yeah, those would be I'm trying to think if there are other ones. I think some of, along with the liquid calories, some of the energy drinks, I think people feel really depleted 4 to 5 hours afterwards, kind of like when I give patients stimulants in middle of the day when the stimulant wears off, so they can get really sad or dysphoric or down.
What about sugary stuff? If you eat a big gallon of ice cream, you're going to probably come down off that.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel that gallon of ice cream in the burger meal, in my mind, when you blend those up, or kind of what's in them, it's kind of the same thing. It's a lot of sugar, a lot of fat, a lot of saturated fat. So, but yes, I think it's, it's that difference. If you're if you're out and you're craving an ice cream cone, it's where I think the way that I think about food and nutrition and nutritional psychiatry is that, one, there's value in just getting that sometimes, but really sitting and enjoying it and having it be a delicious ice cream cone wherever you are. Then there's a way to, the kind of brain food dance of how do we swap or modify that so it's better for you in some way. Maybe that's going to a sorbet or a gelato, or maybe it's going to some other type of treat that you feel a little, healthier. So yeah, but I would say those sugary meals for sure, because simple sugars spike insulin. Insulin has lots and lots of effects on us and our body, including psychological effects. So it's for sure those foods.
Awesome. Well, I think people are going to get a lot out of this episode because people are always looking for different tips on how they can improve their mental health. They're always looking for different ways, hopefully, where nutrition can benefit them in a positive way. If people want to find out more about your books, even your course, like where's the best place for them to connect with you?
Yeah, super. Thanks so much, Doug. And so everybody, if you want to learn about our courses, we train clinicians with how to do nutritional psychiatry and coaches. And then we have a course for individuals really looking to live by the tenets of mental fitness and actualize those, called Healing the Modern Brain. Everything's at drewramseymd.com. And then I'm pretty active on Instagram, so it's an easy way to keep up with me. I try to kind of post some inspiring stories when I'm eating something good, when I'm struggling. I try to be honest about that, and mostly just try to provide a feed that encourages everybody, and as well as men, to take care of their mental health and be active in that pursuit. So yeah, I'm Drew Ramsey MD on all those platforms, and I really hope people will drop by. And Doug, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. It's not so often I get to speak to somebody who's had such a great journey into health. And so I really find it inspiring, man, and keep it up. And I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for coming on, and congrats to you on your own journey. And I invite people who are listening to this to let us know what you thought and share a takeaway with something that Dr. Ramsey said. Maybe it was about anxiety, maybe it was about nutrition and some foods to stay away from. Maybe it was something he said about alcohol that really hit home. Maybe it was something that he said about the Mediterranean diet that you didn't know. Whatever it was, tag him, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.